In looking at this particular time period and this part of Texas, I'm interested in the occupational folk life of musicians as well as the music itself that they're playing. Occupational folk life is a long-standing interest of mine, grounded in a fascination with the many ways in which we construct paradigms of work, ideas about what constitutes a real job or a good job, and what kinds of labor may render us productive members of society. And I identify this particular interest of mine back to the time when my parents started asking me when I would get a real job. The flip side of this examination of the flip side of this is the examination of occupational stigma and the ways in which we collectively devalue work through the denigration of certain kinds of labor and or the stereotypes we construct about the laborers. I'm also interested in unpacking stock phrases often used to describe Texas or parts of Texas, such as Baptist-controlled and musical crossroads. Much is made of Texas' diverse musical life and rapacious syncretism, from Austin's declaration of itself as the live music capital of the world, to the state's claims to be the natural birthplace of just about every genre of music there is. I think it's important to interrogate these grand narratives and to probe the quotidian practices that figure in these constructions. And because I'm considering more than one area of sociocultural endeavor and expression, I've lately been thinking about these issues through Bourdieu's concepts of habitus and cultural field. In the course of this research, I had the very good fortune to meet and get to know legendary Texas steel guitarist James Grabowski, who passed away in 2016 at the age of 87. And it's to him that I'd like to dedicate this talk. If he were here, he'd want to make sure that you had all been offered Coke, iced tea, or a beer before we begin. And he'd be willing to step outside for a smoke break with you later if his wife wasn't around to see it. Aside from the interviews and correspondence with Mr. Grabowski, my research has been primarily archival, and my thanks go to the staff at the Dolph Briscoe Center for American History at the University of Texas at Austin, where I consulted the Alan Turner Oral History Collection consisting of 57 audio cassettes of interviews with performers of traditional Texas music, including Western swing, Cajun swing, and blues. Turner, a Houston-based journalist, conducted the interviews with various assistants between 1972 and 1982. I also owe a debt of gratitude to the Catholic Archives of Texas and particularly archivist Eric Hartman. In this presentation, I rely on the work of Orange, Texas native Dr. Louis Fairchild. Born in 1937, Fairchild's childhood reflections are filled with elements of war. Years later, as a professor of psychology at West Texas A&M University in Canyon, he turned a critical yet compassionate eye to that era in a series of interviews that resulted in the unparalleled oral history collection. They called it the War Effort. Beginning pilot interviews in 1986, Fairchild would complete approximately 30 interviews by the end of the following year. He also solicited interviews via articles in local newspapers, and in the end, he interviewed more than 200 Orange residents. Fairchild's interviews were largely qualitative, utilizing open-ended questions to focus on the impact of the war years on the community, the individual, and his or her family and acquaintances. Fairchild also asked people about their particular experiences of that time as shipyard workers, teachers, grade school students, shopkeepers, preachers, and ethnic and racialized minorities. Most of the original recordings are at the Orange Public Library in Orange, Texas. So I want to give you some background on Orange and the Silver Strip. The Silver Strip referred to in the title of this talk was a red light district on the Texas-Louisiana border, also referred to as East Orange. Really just an unpaved section of road at the edge of town that crossed the Texas-Louisiana border. Like the Strip was in its heyday, the town of Orange is still understood as a dangerous place that one would do well to avoid. A long history of racism and crime, not unlike that of many port cities on the Gulf Coast, along with current controversy, continues to plague Orange. In 2016, the Beaumont Enterprise reported that FBI statistics showed that violent crime doubled from 2014 to 2015. Last year, members of the white supremacist group Aryan Circle, including one man from Orange, were indicted in connection with the 2016 murder of a fellow gang member. An unfinished memorial to the American Civil War Confederacy, the Confederate Memorial of the Wind, on which construction began in 2013, has been a flashpoint for heated confrontations between local civil rights protesters and local racists. The memorial sits on private land near Interstate 10, with a local movement to repurpose the structure established in 2017. And the sign here on the right that you see is a sign that local protesters rented for 1 month. They started a GoFundMe campaign to be able to rent this for $1,500 for a month, asking for the group, the Sons of Confederate Veterans, to reconsider what they were doing with this memorial. And this is the unfinished product that you see here, which is right by I-10, which is the highway that goes into Louisiana. Orange is one point of East Texas' Golden Triangle, an area roughly marked by the cities of Beaumont, Port Arthur, and Orange, sitting just west of the border with Louisiana on the other side of the Sabine River. So Orange is here. Okay. The booming Texas economy that followed the discovery of the Spindletop oil field in 1901 drew a significant influx of Cajun families into the area. By 1902, Cajuns made up the majority of the employees and residents of the first Texas Oil Corporation's refinery and company town near Orange. In two successive waves of immigration to the rapidly industrializing area, the first from 1901 to 1921, and the second beginning in the 1940s, population figures in the area rose so rapidly as to, quote, generate lasting cultural and demographic repercussions in the region, end quote. For example, as you see on the slide here, the population of Orange grew from 765 in 1900 to 46,140 in 1940, an increase primarily attributed to Cajun immigrants. Nearby Port Arthur experienced a similar population explosion, going from 7,600 residents in 1910 to over 50,000 by 1930. In the early years of the 1900s, established industries such as farming, shipping, shipbuilding, lumbering, and oil were bolstered by the dredging of a deep water harbor. This allowed Orange to develop a significant shipbuilding center during World War I. Near the end of the 1930s, though, Orange was still a small, sleepy place. So sleepy, in fact, that Louis Fairchild says, when the Works Project Administration paved some of the streets in the late 1930s, people joked that they had never seen a cemetery covered over with so much concrete. Fairchild went on to write, values and codes of conduct were traditional and exacting, at least publicly. Orange was a familial place and lives were an open book. Despite the area's industry, people continued to struggle with the fallout of the Depression, and steady employment was hard to come by. But the town's fortunes were soon to change dramatically. Settling on the Sabine River with Weaver Shipyards, founded in 1898, and Livingston Shipbuilding Company, established in 1933, Consolidated Steel Corporation constructed a steel fabrication plant in 1940. Shortly thereafter, Livingston won a government contract of about $120,000 to build 24 small steel landing vessels. On the heels of that contract, CSC secured a contract from the U.S. Navy to begin building a shipyard immediately, followed by the fabrication of 12 destroyers at $8 million each. Plans for a 500-unit Navy addition and quarters for hundreds of officers and crew were put into action in anticipation of a population boom. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor near the end of 1971, the pace of production increased. Recruiters traveled by bus through East Texas across the border to Louisiana to solicit workers for the shipyards. Country western bands and banners attracted potential recruits to the county courthouses, as did the recruiters' calls to passersby. Shipbuilders were not the only employers who traveled for recruitment purposes. The huge numbers of people immigrating to the Orange area needed the services of other businesses that in turn required more staff. Douglas Briggs recalled, "I was 25. I didn't come looking for a job. They hired me out of Louisiana." Jarvis Stanfield owned the Quality Cleaners at that particular time, looking for pressers and cleaners. I happened to be standing in front of the shop when they came by. We were making, I believe, $18 a week at that particular time, and here was a man that offered $65 a week for the same type of work. End quote. Texas was viewed as a land of opportunity for many who had endured the Depression, and housing quickly became a serious issue. The federal government brought in demountable houses and trailers, built new houses, and approved even more housing. 2 projects, Riverside and the Riverside Addition, only meant to last 1 to 2 decades, were built on cypress swampland. The location was chosen for its proximity to both the Consolidated and Livingston shipyards. Gasoline was rationed at this time, and great numbers of shipyard workers walked to work. In addition to government housing, there were tent cities and shanty towns, and cots set up just about anywhere. Some newcomers lived in converted chicken coops or slept in their cars if they were lucky enough to have one. For many working class migrants, however, such accommodations were tolerable given their greatly increased incomes and hope that their living conditions would improve in time. Musicians were sometimes put up at the local hotel. Beatrice Fuller, who ran a funeral home with her husband, remembered that, quote, "With the influx coming in, we started knowing that we had to have some more men to run the ambulances. So we built a room in the back. The nightclubs were very popular, and the boys that played over there, it was hard for them to find a place to stay. So they would play over there, and then they would come and run the ambulance at night and sleep here at the funeral home." The socioeconomic disparity evidenced by temporary accommodations was a factor of which both adults and children were aware. French Catholic Bill Bergeron, who was 6 years old in 1941, vividly recalled his self-consciousness about his clothes, his living conditions, and the shoe polish perpetually under his fingernails, from shining sailor's shoes every night for 15 cents a pair. He felt that other children at school looked down on him. Living in a tent with his family and sharing a shower and restroom with other tent dwellers, he was not able to be, quote, "as clean as I wanted to be," end quote. Fairchild's interviews are instructive in revealing the divergence in perception of class-based judgments on both ends of the economic spectrum. Longtime Orange residents expressed both compassion for those marginalized by a lack of formal education, poverty, and/or religious faith, but they also expressed fear of them. Everyone, though, was subject to judgment regarding how their money was spent. Music scholar Ryan A. Brasseau details the socioeconomic position of the Cajuns over time, emphasizing their continual struggles not only with economic hardship, but also with others' contempt for their plight. Over the course of the first half of the 20th century, so many Cajuns left for Southeast Texas that a song cycle developed, broadly known as Grand Texas. And Barry-Jean Ancelet and Carl Lindahl have both written about this song cycle. Cajun musicians Dennis McGee and Ernest Fruget recorded a version in the early 1930s entitled Blues de Texas. And I would like to play this for you.
J'ai passé d'un Yoni, mangé un pain de sou. J'ai mangé la moitié pour mon déjeuner. J'ai gardé l'autre moitié pour mon dîner. Je marchais, mon tout seul, je marchais tous les jours et tous les nuits comme un pauvre malheureux. Depuis à l'âge de 2 ans, je peux l'âme de père et de mère. J'ai traîné les chemins jusqu'à l'âge de 38 ans. J'ai passé pourtant pour j'ai demandé la charité comme un petit morceau de pain. Comment il me mange, je fais moi tout seul dans les chemins, tous les jours et tous les nuits. J'avais guetté pour quelqu'un de ramasser. Ça me donne de l'assistance et d'aide pour un pauvre pelin comme moi.
Geographer Dean Lauder and historian Michel Leblanc have observed that, quote, the Cajuns who departed Louisiana during the agricultural depression of the 1920s and the Great Depression of the 1930s were the most marginal of the marginals, the people who had less than the Louisiana prairie people who had nothing, unquote. Historian Shane Bernard maintains that poverty was so widespread at this time that many in this area of Louisiana were not even aware of the depression, as it did not significantly change their circumstances. Texas music historian Gene Boyd confirms that conditions for ethnic minorities in the state of Texas were devastating as well. For example, the city of Houston denied relief money to African Americans and Mexican Americans on the grounds that to fund these minority groups would mean depriving more deserving whites. Although East Texas oil fields and associated businesses offered steady employment, Cajuns were working long hours for relatively low wages. Ben Benoit, working for M.W. Kellogg, a petrochemical company in Port Arthur in the 1940s, told folklorist Carl Lindahl that he made $40 a week. He told Carl, quote, my kids don't believe I ever worked for that little money, but they do believe it when I tell them that the Cajuns got the jobs in the refineries around here because they were willing to work so hard. The Texas people wouldn't work like that. That's how we got these jobs. So the young man who was talking about getting the dry cleaning job for $65 a week, and here we have a figure of $40 a week working at the petrochemical company. Around this same time, farmers in this area were making about $3 to $4 a week, just to give you a range there. However, Cajun expatriates were in direct competition for these jobs with working-class Texans, exacerbating tension between the groups and also between all other minority groups. School-aged children were teased because of their Cajun accents and taunted with ethnic slurs, such as, please excuse me, Cooney and Coonass. Cajuns retaliated against Coonass jokes with ethnic barbs of their own directed at Anglo-Texans. And Shane Bernard, in his writing, relates one of the jokes that he identifies as a perennial favorite among Cajuns. What's the difference between a Coonass and a horse's ass? The Sabine River. Yes. Okay, So Cajun group identity was reinforced not only by maintaining traditional practices such as foodways, music making, and folklore, but by the prejudice with which their Anglo-Texan neighbors, and in many cases bosses, met them. Orange continued to draw individuals from Louisiana and elsewhere through World War II as the town's shipbuilding companies won multi-million-dollar contracts from the Navy. Fairchild wrote, quote, "Sailors from Russia, limeys from England, grandfathers from Kentucky, gamblers from Little Rock, electricians from West Texas, school teachers everywhere, they all came to Orange. Excitement and exhilaration were in the air. Frenetic, hectic, everything assumed a sense of urgency. The activity level reminded one visitor of a stampede," end quote. While some settled in East Texas with their families, a greater number of single male itinerant workers supported an entertainment industry that developed in the area. The men worked very long hours but had money to burn in the little leisure time that they had. It was the steady business of these industrial workers that supported the development of the Silver Strip. This section of US 90 on the Louisiana side of the Sabine River had it all: live music venues, houses of prostitution, and a variety of gambling opportunities. Shipyard worker Eddie Morris told Fairchild that, quote, "It was wide open from here to as far as you could go into Louisiana, and there was a honky-tonk every 100 feet. It was just wide open from daylight to dark. 4 or 5 of the places never did close, never even had no doors on them. It was always something going, and it was lots of fun," end quote. Following the construction of the Interstate Highway 10 bridge in 1960, the Silver Strip was largely abandoned. Some of the formerly notorious structures are crumbling ruins today, as shown in these photos of Felix de Mary's Supper Club, but some of the buildings were converted to other uses. The brothel that sat alongside the Grove Dinner Club, for example, became the home of the Foursquare Duck Club. Club president Pat Beard recalled the structure's history, noting that the building was 2 stories in East Orange's heyday. Cockfighting ring downstairs, brothel upstairs. Next door, the Grove held up to 1,000 patrons who enjoyed the gaming tables and touring bands as well as food. Other clubs included the Night Owl, Buster's Nightclub, the Flamingo, Stompin' Henry's, and Speedy's Broken Mirror Club. But the most notorious of the area's enterprising businesses was the Showboat. Billed as America's largest floating dance pavilion, the vessel was permanently moored just the other side of the bridge that connected Orange and East Orange. This immense Mississippi River stern-wheel steamer was, as an Orange resident told Fairchild, quote, "the roughest place of them all over there. If people wanted to get in trouble, they could get in trouble there." Cajun musicians Leo Swallow and the Rhythm Boys were hired as the house band at the Showboat in October of 1944. Swallow and a previous band, the Three Aces, made Cajun music history in 1935 by becoming the first ensemble to cut a Cajun-inflected Western swing recording and the first Cajun band to record with drums, played by Tony Gonzalez. The lineup of the Swallows Rhythm Boys in 1944 included drummer Crawford Vincent, who told Houston music historian Andrew Brown, quote, "We were playing these clubs around Port Arthur mostly. Then this fellow here said, 'Boy, this is a booming town. You should move over here.' So we moved over there and had this sit-down job." Vincent remembered the band's time there as very lucrative, saying, "We'd start playing around 8:30 until about 2 or 3 o'clock. He had us on salary, and we get a lot of tips because the people in Texas tips more than Louisiana. I hate to say that, but we had a lot of tips, and we'd make sometimes $40 or $50 a week. These people that were coming in on the late hours from the shipyard, there wasn't nothing cheap about those people," end quote. At this time, the band was living in the Sykes Hotel, which was basically a rooming house in Orange, and which Harry Schultz accidentally set on fire at least once when they were staying there. Clarence A. Parkhurst, who grew up in Orange, helped his father run a recreation parlor on the Strip. He remembered, quote, "Moon Mullican would come in with his band, and he had real good music and good singers. You'd listen to him while you was eating," end quote. Aubrey Wilson Mullican, nicknamed Moon, and also king of the hillbilly piano players, was a singer-songwriter and pianist who famously performed with Cliff Bruner's Texas Wanderers, the Sunshine Boys, and Jimmy Davis. Ensembles such as Mullican's and Swallow's Rhythm Boys would be expected to perform popular tunes from a range of genres. Brown notes that the Rhythm Boys' repertoire favored Western swing. Ryan Brasseau points out that at this time, quote, an assortment of musical contexts coexisted simultaneously, end quote. And moreover, a group's measure of success was judged on how well an ensemble could interpret hillbilly and American popular compositions. Jim Grabowski confirmed that to be a successful touring band in the 40s and 50s, a group's repertoire had to include a range of styles to suit regional demographics. Musicians had to be able to perform whatever would get and keep the local audience on the dance floor. So Mr. Grabowski explained to me that when bands he was in would play in South Texas, they would be sure to play some mariachi tunes or other Spanish language tunes. When they were in Central Texas and the German and Czech areas, they would be sure to play some polkas. And when they were over east, they would be sure to play some Cajun tunes. At the same time, and for perhaps the first time, it was possible to hear a Cajun tune on the radio, buy the record, and also to hear the tune played live in a bar or club. The years immediately following World War II, specifically 1946 to 1951, saw a defining moment in Cajun and American popular music. As discussed in detail by a number of scholars, Harry Schote's 1946 recording of Jolie Blanc caught fire and would later become known as the Cajun National Anthem. Working against the dissemination and syncretism of various vernacular musics, Andrew Brown claims, was the fact that Orange was ruled by conservative Baptists who did everything they could to discourage drinking and dancing within city limits, end quote. However, various authorities turned a blind eye to gambling in East Orange. The Strip was lawless in other ways too. Fights broke out often. One resident recalled that while some establishments were considered respectable and known for food, music, and dancing, others were known more as, quote, buckets of blood, end quote. Another longtime resident described biting the fingertip off of another patron in a bar fight. Riley LeBlanc, whose family moved to Orange from Louisiana when he was 5 years old, witnessed the murder of a sailor who had befriended him on the sidewalk outside of a beer joint where Riley and his friends sometimes shined shoes. Jeanette Robinson writes, quote, after a wild weekend, bodies would be found floating in the river, but little or nothing was ever done to find out who killed these people and why, end quote. As the Strip was technically outside Orange city limits, the Navy's shore patrol had some jurisdiction over the area, at least on paper. And the Strip, after all, was in Louisiana, not Texas. Historians Walter Cowan and Jack McGuire write that, quote, there had long been an understanding, honored by Louisiana governors Jones, Davis, and Long, that the state police would patrol the highways and assist local law enforcement agencies when called upon, but that sheriffs would handle gambling in their jurisdictions and determine the nature and extent of enforcement regarding vice, end quote. The Orange police chief, who at one time was Riley LeBlanc's father, the little boy who saw someone murdered in front of him, his father would respond in extreme circumstances, such as a corpse being found in the river. LeBlanc told Fairchild, quote, any number of times people would call Daddy and tell him about things that were going on across the river that he'd need to come and see about. They called him one time and they said, there's a man over here floating in the water. Can you come see about him? He said, well, no, I've got no authority or jurisdiction over there. And they said, well, we've called and we can't get the sheriff to come see about it, end quote. Chief LeBlanc finally persuaded the Lake Charles sheriff to meet him at the Strip to examine the corpse. Lake Charles was about 35 miles or 56 kilometers from Orange. But the Louisiana lawman was not interested in pursuing what was clearly a murder, as, quote, the deceased had 2 holes in there you could stick your fingers in where somebody'd shot him and killed him, end quote. The incident underscores Louisiana authorities' disinterest in investigating crime on the Silver Strip at the time. Raids would come later in the early 1950s during the governorship of Robert F. Kennan. Originally from Louisiana, Isaac Dupre was hired on the spot at the Livingston shipyard. He bought a trailer house for $250, the entirety of his savings. When his pregnant wife and child returned to Louisiana to be with her family, Dupre moved into the trailer next door. Aware of the potential danger of this strip, his new housemate, an older man, often asked Dupre to accompany him on trips across the river. He said, quote, I'd go over there every once in a while with the old man on the weekend when he'd go gambling. He wanted me to stick around him. He's kind of afraid that he would win, and now I'll tell you what would happen. There's several bodies turned up around back in them waters. So I'd go with him to keep him company, especially when they'd get ready to come home. He was afraid. I was young. I wasn't afraid. That bridge was constant. All day long they were going, end quote. Walter McCarver confirmed the threat of violence, saying, quote, they had some rough times in them honky-tonks. Around 10:30 or 11 o'clock, you better watch out because somebody'd steal you if you didn't watch them. Ooh, yeah, there was a lot of cutting, end quote. A corollary of Orange's population boom was the fact that a town in which everybody knew each other, or at least thought they did, was suddenly inundated by strangers from a variety of ethnic and religious backgrounds. Townsfolk who were used to closely monitoring each other's behavior found that their opinions had little to no effect on their new neighbors. Concerns for the security of private property increased, and people spoke of having to keep their front doors locked for the first time. Some of the newcomers, as we've seen, went missing across the river. Cowboy Adams Jr. explained to Louis Fairchild, quote, then they had thugs. They all pulled in here to this place. They would knock people in the head to get their money, and sometimes they'd kill them, and sometimes they wouldn't. Sometimes they'd throw them in the river, and all kind of stuff like that. That was real common at that time. And there was so many people coming here that didn't have no identity on them. Back in those days, everybody wasn't identified and fingerprinted like they are now, and nobody went to the dentist. They couldn't look in their mouths and tell who they were, and they didn't know where they come from. A lot of people didn't even have social security numbers or anything. End quote. So a certain segment of newer residents were considered disposable. Obstacles to positive identification certainly played a part in the grim calculation, and there was always someone ready to take on a job that was newly vacant. So what does this tell us about the working conditions of musicians, including Cajun musicians? Although in some cases musicians were paid at higher rates than shipyard workers, the work environment was clearly perilous. Violence could break out at any time and would not be checked by intervention. When ensembles such as Leo Swallow's Rhythm Boys enjoyed a residency at the Showboat, and some apparently lived at the funeral home, others would travel hundreds of miles to play a show, then get back into their vehicles in the wee hours of the morning to drive back to a live radio gig that they had to play by contract during the day. Highway accidents were a significant occupational hazard. Many of Alan Turner's interviewees described terrible accidents in which band members were injured or killed. Mr. Grabowski recalled that fellow musicians often took speed to stay awake, not just while driving to and from engagements, but during the gigs as well, due to constant exhaustion from this schedule. Circumstances such as these, however, did not stop representatives of local religious institutions from taking advantage of the wealth generated by the Silver Strip. Marion Von Dolan, who ran the Grove Dinner Club with her husband, Sam Smith, recalled, quote, we had a Baptist minister who came to us one day and said, Mr. Smith, we need a public address system for our backyard and our church, and tables and benches. And my husband said, well, how much would that cost, Reverend? He said, well, the men can do the job. They can make the benches and hook up the public address system, but the whole thing will be around $1,000. My husband gave him $1,000. The following week on the radio, this same minister is preaching about the den of iniquity called the Grove, not just once. And I should mention at this point, there is a phrase, the backdoor Baptist. And those are the Baptists who come around to the back of the liquor store so that nobody will see them. In my family, I have both the Baptists and the people who ran the liquor store. And that's how I learned this phrase was from my grandfather, who worked at a liquor store and who was descended from a fine tradition of bootleggers. Baptists may have dealt with businesses on the strip in a hypocritical fashion, but other religious figures benefited from their largesse more directly. Von Dolen also recalled that the Grove lost money because a lot of the patrons were high rollers. She said, quote, "We had like cardinals and priests that traveled through. We never even let them pay a check. We always picked them up. There were a lot of freebies, that's it. More as a public relations than anything else," end quote. So while Baptists might justify the use of funds from a den of iniquity for a higher purpose, such as their church public address system, freely indulging in the pleasures of the establishment, as did the cardinals and priests, would be a serious transgression from a Baptist perspective, supporting an already dim view of the Catholic Church. Encounters with drunken priests also figure as pivotal moments in musicians' attitudes towards the Catholic Church. And some of these stories that musicians told about drunken priests were also stories about car wrecks. Okay, now I'm going to talk a little bit about dancing. Dancing was a dubious pastime, as some Protestant clergy believed dancing nearly as sinful as drinking. In her memoir of life in Orange, Carrie Joyner Wolliver writes that Baptist church elders frowned upon dancing. Wolliver grew up in the 1940s and 50s, and she relates a story about a Baptist boy voted class king in junior high. She said, "Of course he was crowned at our prom at the school, but he had to stand on the sidelines while everybody else danced," end quote. In conversation with Fairchild, Anna J. Caffey attributed her ability to avoid drinking while still dancing often to her Christianity. She told Fairchild, quote, "But you see, I was a Christian. I became a Christian when I was 12, so all of that didn't entice me. Now, I certainly went across the river, and I've danced 1,002 miles. I'm not trying to make you think I'm a saint, but I'm saying it would have been so easy for me to have gone this way rather than the right way. My husband and I laughed many a time about how easy it would have been for me to have gone to work in a bar across the river," end quote. So there were options for those who wanted to dance but not go across the river. The USO provided an alcohol-free space, at least in theory, for socializing that apparently even children could enjoy. French Catholic David J. Broussard attended St. Mary's Catholic School as a child. He recalled heading to the USO after school with his friends. Quote, "There was literally thousands of servicemen, but this didn't bother us little old shaggy-headed kids because there was always a good time around there. When the serviceman was off duty, hey man, things started happening because they's going to have dances there just about every night. It was a haven for little kids. I don't know, you was just kind of a novelty for the sailors. You could always pick up a nickel off of any of them." Lillian Robinson also grew up in Orange. She was in high school at the time of the attack on Pearl Harbor. She married her high school sweetheart 2 days after they graduated, and he joined the Army 3 months later. Lillian got a job with the Navy at Consolidated Steel and also volunteered at the USO. Married women volunteers had to have permission from their husbands to dance with the Navy personnel. She explained, quote, "When my husband came home on his first leave, he went to the USO with me. And at that time, the rules were that married people could not dance with the sailors unless they had their husband's permission. So I loved to dance, and he signed permission for me to be a dancing USO hostess. Now, there were quite a few men who would not. They would object to their wives dancing, but my husband did not," end quote. Even at venues that were considered respectable, such as the USO, as an activity involving bodily contact, dancing was closely monitored. In this case, dancing was morally acceptable as part of the war effort, and with the husband's written approval, as it contributed to the morale of both the enlisted men and local residents. Ministers of all denominations felt a responsibility to uphold Christian values as understood through the particular lens of their faith during this time of turmoil and transition. For them, as well as members of their congregations, drinking establishments of any kind were a serious threat to not only individuals' health and happiness, but also to the stability of family and thus the community at large. Asked about moral standards during the war years, Baptist minister Cleon Hogan said, quote, "Morals were very low, generally speaking. There's lots of Christian people that held up and lived according to their standard right on through, but there was a don't care spirit to a large degree among lots of people. They kind of let down and gave in to the pressures. It's like I say, prosperity makes a difference in people. Their whole disposition will change when they get prosperous. They don't even seem like the same people, and that works over into the church too. People that were humble and friendly and gentle, kind, some of them became haughty and arrogant and hard to deal with, and sassy," end quote. The sudden influx of people into the Orange area, including Cajuns, upended many longtime Orange residents' worldview and sense of place. From the tense city that disrupted ideas of home and personal property, to the long lines for everything from dry goods to seats at lunch counters, nothing was as it had been. Anti-Catholicism, a virulent trope in both religious and political thought in the United States, was undoubtedly fanned into flame by the appearance of hundreds of Catholic migrants camping in tents in the midst of town, adding to what Brasseau calls festering ethnic and class tensions between Cajuns and Texans. A disruptive temporality played a role as well. Both established and new residents of Orange grappled with a sense of ephemerality as everyone looked toward the end of the war. People described it as a, quote, twilight zone time, something that had to be endured for the duration. The Silver Strip was a glaring manifestation of the liminality of the war years. The Cajun worldview diverged from that of Anglo-Protestants. Derogatory Cajun stereotypes already fixed in the region by the time of the mass migrations into Texas certainly played a role in the manner in which some Orange residents responded to their new neighbors. Ryan Brasseau maintains that Cajuns were not seen as good capitalists and therefore not good citizens, as they did not appear to seek wealth through the accumulation of goods or the exploitation of power imbalances. Indeed, arguing for more attention to structure and socioeconomic conditions in the analysis of ethnicity, sociologists Jacques Henry and Carl Bankston write, quote, "Some Acadians became Cajuns not because of their cultural heritage, upper-class Acadians shared in it, but because of their lower economic status. The rural, poorest, least educated strata of Louisiana Acadians were labeled Cajuns," end quote. Nor was the traditional Cajun use of land in line with what has been identified by scholars as Protestant land-use patterns. Examining Anglo-American conceptions of French land use from 1780 to 1860, literature scholar Edward Watts observes, quote, "French and American approaches to the land reveal a marked contrast in values. The French viewed the land as a way of supporting a way of life, neighborly, egalitarian, and village-based. The Anglos viewed it as a means to wealth, individualistic, acquisitive, and farm as property-based," end quote. While scholars point toward a significant difference in worldview, it's also important to consider the immediate material conditions in which Cajuns developed and sought to continue their traditions in Texas. Music and dancing were crucial components of Cajun social practice, while at the same time taboo for other Orange residents. The spatial organization of the town, suddenly accommodating thousands of new residents, forced economically struggling individuals into makeshift communities that in many ways exacerbated their already marginal status. Following traditional patterns of socialization through music and dance was not seen as restorative and community building by longtime Protestant residents, or as expressions of cultural capital, but as irresponsible, both in terms of time and money, and particularly in relation to family obligations. Children left untended while their parents worked or played were not brought up right. While there's no question that anti-Catholicism has been and remains a significant trope in American religious thought and political thought, in the case of wartime Orange, it's one of many strands that linked people together, for better or worse, mostly worse, in an overwhelming and confounding period of socioeconomic change. In documenting and analyzing vernacular religion, I am looking to consider not only how Baptists and Catholics lived their faith, but also how they lived their understandings of other faiths, how they interpreted those other faiths through the lens of their own. The vernacular religious practices of Protestant denominations, so invested in differentiating themselves from, and I think in a real sense policing Catholicism, provide insight into a crucial area of religion as it's lived. Through their narratives, as well as those of Catholics, the folklore of transition is illuminated, revealing the symbolic boundaries of faith, both reinforced and resisted in everyday encounters. Thank you.
What language were the most of the traditional songs that the musicians played in the Orange area? What language were they in?
I think those would be mostly English or French.
Okay, so just
Acadian
very
French.
heavy accent. Because I was wondering like what language the song you played.
Oh, that song, yeah, French.
Yeah, okay.
Acadian French.
Okay,
Yeah.
Acadian
Yeah. Yes.
French. Were there, in your research, did you come across any cases of scandals where local Baptists would be caught or otherwise seen, attending the Silver Strip? I think it's highly unlikely that they didn't.
Yes.
Some of them.
I think you're right, but I didn't come across any accounts where somebody was specifically identified as a Baptist, except for the one where they went asking for money.
Yeah.
There's one easy question and then one harder one. I was wondering if there were other denominations that are Catholics in this area?
Yes, there were a variety of denominations, including Methodist, Presbyterian. There was a very small Jewish congregation for a while. But it's not like, there were only Baptist churches. There were a variety of churches, and some of them mentioned by Fairchild's interviewees are still on the go today, such as St. Mary's Catholic Church. And that was one of the things that really interested me about this, in looking into the history of Orange and the way that various religions developed or, built churches and this and that and gained congregations from the early days. In terms of numbers, I don't think the Baptists outnumbered everybody, is what I'm trying to say.
And I really like your idea of looking at how religion is lived, but also how other religions are lived. I think that's really fascinating. That makes me wonder a little bit about whether you've ever thought about parallels in Newfoundland, which when the 1940s, for instance, was also a pretty tumultuous, controversial kind of time period.
I haven't thought about it, but yes, that's very interesting as well. When I was a kid, I participated in a lot of Catholic traditions without realizing it, because they were kind of built into daily life in West Texas. And it's kind of embarrassing in a way to realize that you've been, eating fish on Friday for 18 years, not because your school liked to serve fish on Fridays necessarily, but because it was for the Catholics and things like that. So those kinds of things, yeah, I think are interesting and would be interesting to look at in terms of Newfoundland as well. Thank you, Bev.
Hi, this was fantastic. I was wondering if in those interviews, issues between the Baptists and the Catholics regarding Catholic social occasions ever came up. I'm thinking of, my own experience as a Catholic child in the United States of like bingo and the beer and wine, which flows copiously at like my family's parish's German Fest, which strike me as things, I'm from Kansas, so just a few states to the north, and there's definitely some commentary from our own local Baptists about those events. So I'm wondering if that came up in this research process.
Yeah, I was looking for things like that, but I have not found any yet. As I mentioned, I spent a long time at the Catholic Archives of Texas, and I did find diaries of a Catholic priest who seemed to feel quite threatened, although I'm not positive what he felt threatened by, except for I think at the particular period that he was writing, I think it was the KKK. And so a complicating factor in this research is the fact that, I had a grand idea that I would visit all the churches in the area and they would open their record books to me and I would find these amazing commentaries. But what I found was that a lot of churches had lost the majority of their records due to hurricanes and tropical storms. In some cases, they would send me 3 pages that they had managed to salvage from a church history written in the 1960s. But yeah, I was looking for exactly what you're talking about, and I haven't found those yet.
So about the servicemen in your talk, they kind of seem to be like a wholly outside force, both as a resource to be exploited and as just people. But was there an overall like theme of the delineations that they were a part of? Did the fact that the servicemen, that a good number of the servicemen wouldn't necessarily have been Baptist, influence any animosity towards them? Because they seem to be generally, like in the way you talk, other than the silver strip, they seem to be like everyone seemed to kind of turn a blind eye to them for the sake of their money that they gave.
Well, actually, what people talked about in terms of the servicemen themselves was not liking them. And that their behavior was very aggressive, and they started fights. The people who talked about, servicemen coming to their establishments talked about wishing they didn't come and having to kick them out sometimes because of fights and also being quite aggressive towards women. And that's another area that people commented on, was concern for the young women of the town who were, they felt, overly attracted to the servicemen who were no good. That's a great question, though. Thank you.
If I could just ask a question, I'm wondering who is making money from all of this? Where was all the cash flowing?
Well, some of the businesses, a lot of the businesses in Orange did really well during this period, just because they were, some of them described, like working day and night just to try and keep up with demand, because there were so many more customers. Even people who sold and repaired shoes talked about just having to, work their fingers to the bone to keep up with everybody. The money from the strip, I suppose that's where the most of the money was coming in. I have have an idea that a lot of that money was going into organized crime, but I don't have any proof.